This week on Video Game Takeout, we follow up on a promise I made way back in episode 1 by reviewing Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival for the Game Boy Advance. And since I made you wait so long, I've decided to do 2 other Street Fighter games as an extra bonus. Street Fighter Alpha for the Game Boy Color, and Street Fighter Alpha 3 for the Game Boy Advance. So let's get on with it, shall we? First up, Street Fighter Alpha for the Game Boy Color. Street Fighter Alpha is sort of a spin-off of the main Street Fighter series that uses more anime style and many different characters, both new and some from older Capcom franchises. The game was a big hit both in arcades and on the home consoles, but this is the only portable version of the game. The Game Boy Color was never really known for its fighting games, and there's a good reason for that. It only has 2 buttons. Add that to the small screen size, and it's not really an optimal platform for these types of games. But despite all that, the game manages to pack a lot of fun into a small space. First things first, if you haven't watched part 1 of this review, go back to it now, because I'm going to compare this game to the Game Boy one and show you how it's better and how it's worse. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. The first big difference is that the game is based on a totally different game, but the two definitely share a lot of the same concepts and play mechanics. One thing you'll notice as soon as the match starts is that the characters are much smaller than the characters in the Game Boy game. This is both good and bad. Sure, they're a little smaller and less detailed, but they make up for it with vastly superior animation and more responsive controls. Speaking of the controls, the game only has 2 buttons available to it, so it makes them into punch and kick. The harder you press them, the stronger the punch or kick. Since there are no other buttons, this is basically the best they could do. It's not ideal, but it's not awful either. Street Fighter 2 on the Game Boy was fine for its time, but this game does it all so much better in terms of how to bring a game to portable systems. Well, I shouldn't say all, because the one thing that really suffers is the sound in this game. The music is not too bad, but the sound effects are not good at all, which is too bad because this is one of the places that the previous game was really strong. Another problem is that this game heavily favors people who play defensively. There's no limit to how much you can block in this game, so you're better suited to be a counter-puncher. The problem exists in all versions of this game though, so if it didn't bother you before, it won't bother you now. The absolute biggest problem with this game though is the total lack of a 2-player option. It's single player only, and for Street Fighter, that's a big problem. My one last complaint is that when you beat the game, all you get is a lame text-only ending. Even still pictures would have been better than this. I have a feeling that both the sound and the lame endings were victims of limited cart space on the Game Boy Color. The thing about this game is that there are way more pluses than minuses. The game controls well, has great animations, and it has some of the best background art on the Game Boy Color. And it includes all the fighters from the original game. The designers of this game had to cut things to make it fit. Most of the cuts were reasonable, except for the omission of the 2-player support. I still wish the music and sound could be a bit better, especially because the sound was so good in the previous game, and I wish the endings were more than just text, but for what they had to work with, I think they did a great job. This game was pretty late in the Game Boy Color's life, so I don't think many people had the chance to play it. If you see it at your local store or online for a good price, I'd say get it. It's a good game, and since it's the only way to play the original Street Fighter Alpha on the go, if you really like that game, this one's for you. Next up, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival. First off, since we're moving to the GBA, the graphics have been upgraded significantly. Not only in the game, but in the menus too. The new portrait art is nice and reminiscent of the Udon comic style that's going into the new HD remix of the game. The game has all the fighters from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo as the title suggests, which is awesome, and they all play just like they should. In fact, the control is great overall. Every move works just like you want it to, and the hit detection is spot on. Air combos, throw escapes, they're all here. The game also includes the super bar at the bottom of the screen. I'm not really a big fan of it, but it doesn't hurt it much. Every part of the gameplay is right on the money, just as you remember it. Now let's talk about the AI. The AI is pretty difficult. It's not unbeatable or anything, but I definitely would think that the harder difficulties could challenge even the most hardcore player. The one thing I don't like about the AI is that it can still be cheap at times. This is a problem with all versions of Street Fighter 2. The computer can pull off moves that take the 2-second hold instantly, like for example, Sonic Booms or Bison's Psycho Crusher. It does it a lot less than the Super Nintendo and the arcade versions, but it's still annoying. Just like the Game Boy Color game, this game is really lacking in the music department. I much prefer the soundtrack from the original Game Boy game to this one. I think they tried to remix it and make it more jazzy, but in the process they took out all the great beats and slowed the tempo, making it much less exciting to fight to. But the sound is not all bad. The sound effects are still intact and they sound great. Also, they managed to get the voice clips of the announcer in there, and the clips of the characters when they do their special moves. Just like the Game Boy Color version, the button setup is limited due to the GBA only having 4 buttons. But this game gives you a lot of options to change how you want them set up. I just wish they made it easier to do. You have to scroll through each choice for each button instead of pushing the button you want for that move. As a side note, this game has all the bonus stages that the original Game Boy version was missing. My one last complaint is that the endings are just a single picture with text. Even the Super Nintendo version had rudimentary animations to tell the stories of the characters. Still, it's better than nothing, and the art for most of the endings is pretty good. Overall, I'd say this is a really solid game and a vast improvement over the previous 2 games. It's an easy pick up and play game, and it's great for a portable system. It's a lot easier on the eyes than the other 2, and it's pretty easy to find for about 10 to 15 bucks. Is it the best Street Fighter game for the handheld? Well, we still have one more to look at before I can tell you that. Up next, Street Fighter Alpha 3. First off, this game was ported by the same team that did the first Alpha game for the Game Boy Color. This game is a really great port considering that it's on the GBA. All the menus and presentations have remained intact. Now let's get down to the gameplay. The gameplay is exactly like the arcade and home versions. As far as I can tell, all the moves are just as they should be and all the characters are there. In fact, the GBA version introduces 3 new characters to the game. They are Eagle from the original Street Fighter, Maki from Final Fight 2, and Yoon from Street Fighter 3. This game has surprisingly good graphics for the Game Boy Advance. Sure, all the characters have been downsized a bit, but they all look good on the small screen, and more importantly, they all play the way they should. The backgrounds are really nice too. Everything about this game is really well done and polished. Everything except the music, that is. The sound effects are great, and they sound just like the home version, except maybe a bit more compressed. But yet again, the music has suffered horribly. It sounds more like music you might hear from the Neo Geo Pocket than the arcade original. It's really very poor, and Capcom has been guilty of this a lot of times on the GBA. On a side note, the game also doesn't have the announcer voice that starts off the round. Kinda disappointing, but it's really not that big a part of the game. Since Capcom basically licensed this game out to another company, I can kinda understand the poor sound. But when you have a strong base like the Street Fighter series to pull music from, it seems silly that it's this bad. I would have preferred any of the older soundtracks to this one. The last thing I want to talk about is the difficulty. This game is tough. You need to be pretty good at Street Fighter to beat it on even the default difficulty. I find this to be the case in all versions of Street Fighter Alpha 3 though, so it's really nothing new. Just a warning for first-time players. If you're not very good at Street Fighter, either dial down the difficulty or play Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival for the Game Boy Advance because it was much easier. Overall, this game has a ton of fighters, great graphics, and amazing control. Really, the only downside for this one is the music, and that's really not a big enough problem to stop me from recommending it. I wish they had fixed it, but in the end, it's a small thing. This is a great game, and for people who prefer the Alpha games over the main series, this is the way to go. I haven't played the more recent PSP version, but just thinking about that D-pad makes my thumb hurt. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is the best portable version of the game. I highly recommend you go check it out. As far as which game is the best, it's hard to say. Both the GBA games are pretty good. I think it basically comes down to which series you like better. They're both great ports of their respective games, and they both have pretty much identical pros and cons. So just pick your favorite series and go have some fun. Well, that wraps up another week. I finally got around to finishing up Street Fighter, so I hope you liked it. If you have any questions, comments, or viewer art, you can email me at videogametakeout@gmail.com. If you want to see more episodes, both new and old, head over to videogametakeout.blogspot.com or just Google Video Game Takeout. New episodes come out every Monday, so be sure to check back every week. Well, that's our show, so until next week, I'm Ben, thanks for watching, and have a great week.